Hello. My name is Francisco Cantú, and I'm the author of The Line Becomes a River. This book just came out less than a week ago, and I'm on book tour right now. But I kind of just want to cancel this book tour and like read these three books in a bathtub. So I'm very happy to be here, and it's wonderful to hear from these other authors. My book is about the years that I spent in the United States Border Patrol. And the book is really about coming to terms with the violent nature of that work and the ways in which I was made to participate in violent institution and violent policies. So I should just say, first and foremost, it's not a rah-rah Border Patrol book. If you're looking for that, I can direct you elsewhere. Um, I grew up in Arizona, and I'm the son of a park ranger. My mother used to work in Yellowstone. She worked in the Grand Canyon. So as a young boy, I grew up very close to the land and to outdoor spaces. And so I grew up in the Southwest. And my mother's father, my grandfather, crossed the border in 1910, fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. So by the time I got to college, I had all of these different pushes and pulls, but I ended up studying immigration and border issues, and I think part of that was rooted in sort of a desire to like more deeply understand the place that I come from, both as a physical space and in my heritage and my family. So I became completely obsessed with the border. I studied abroad in Mexico. I read everything that I could get my hands on. And by the time I was ready to graduate college, I went to school in D.C. I knew that I wanted to go back home to Arizona, and that I knew that a lot of the learning I had been doing in books, it felt really disconnected from the desert and the landscape that I had grown up in. And so I was really, I was filled with all of these questions. I think a lot of the same questions that we have right now about the border and about immigration. But I was also looking to connect those to like the physical space of the border. So when I started looking at like all of the options that would possibly give me both of those things, um, much to my mother's horror, uh, kind of the only way to do that seemed to be joining the Border Patrol. Um, so I joined the Border Patrol. I spent 3.5 years doing that work, and my job as a Border Patrol agent was actually probably much like you might imagine it. All those stereotypical things of like driving on lonely dirt roads looking for footprints, a car chase here and there, a drug bust here and there. Um, but the other big part of the job was was arresting people who were crossing the border, looking for a better life, and that was sort of the more constant part of the job. But it was also the part of the job that you're encouraged to sort of put away, right? You're encouraged to feel good about, the drug busts and the car chases, but you're not really encouraged to do a lot of thinking about those interactions. So the first two parts of my book especially are preoccupied with those interactions. And I want to read a short bit from the first part of that book, this book. Outside, I looked at their faces in the glare of my headlights. The pregnant woman seemed young. Where did you learn English? I asked. Iowa, she told me quietly. I grew up there, she said. I even got my GED. She kept her head down and avoided my gaze as she talked, glancing up only briefly at my uniformed body. Why did you leave? I asked her. She told me that she had returned to Morelos to care for her younger siblings after their mother died. In Morelos, I made some money teaching English at the kindergarten, she said. I even tutored the adults in my village, people preparing for the journey north. For a few seconds, she seemed proud, and then she shook her head. But the money there, she said, it isn't enough. She glanced at her husband. It was my idea to cross, she said. I wanted our child to have a life here, like I did. The man took a moment to look at me in the light. Listen, he said, do you think you could bring us back to Mexico, como hermano? You could just drive us down to the border, he pleaded. You could just leave us there, ahí en la línea, like a brother. I sighed and turned my head, squinting in the darkness beyond the church. I have to bring you in, I told them. It's my job. The man took a deep breath and nodded, and then climbed into the back of the transport van, holding out his arms to help his pregnant wife. At the station, I sorted through their things with them, discarding perishables and sharp objects. I had them remove their belts and their shoelaces, and I tagged their backpacks and handed them a claim ticket. I counted and took note of their money, in pesos and in dollars, and handed it back to them, telling them to keep it close. Inside the processing center, I filled out their voluntary return papers and entered their names into the computer. Before leaving them in their cell, I wished them luck on their journey and asked them to be safe, to always think of their child. Later that night, as I sat in the transport van listening to the calls come out over the radio, I realized I had forgotten their names. So I read from that section of the book because to me, looking back on that experience, the fact that I would forget these people's names is really the first step in dehumanizing someone. And I think, so much of the rhetoric that we see now encourages us to look at migrants as part of an undifferentiated mass. And the language that we use to talk about migration and to talk about migrants encourages us to look at people these way. We talk about a flood of migrants. We talk about, an invasion or a tide. We talk about people as being illegal. And now we conflate migrants with MS-13 gang members, or we talk about chain migration instead of family reunification. So, after I left the Border Patrol, those kinds of interactions, those people-to-people connections were what I carried with me. The drug busts and the car chases, all of that really faded away. And after I left the Border Patrol is when I began writing this book. I didn't join the patrol thinking that I would write this book. And then I should say that the third part of this book, it really is quite a shift from what comes before it. After leaving the Border Patrol, I kind of tried to get as far away from the Border Patrol as I could. So I went to grad school. I was studying creative writing. And I was working as a barista in a coffee shop, kind of as far as you could get. But the maintenance man at the coffee shop where I worked was an undocumented migrant, I would later find out. And I built a friendship up with him over the course of maybe 2 years. And then one day, he didn't show up to work, and he'd never missed a day of work. So I asked what had happened to him, and he had left the country to go visit his dying mother. And 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, when he still hadn't come back, that's when I found out that he was undocumented. And when I got in touch with his family, I found out that he had been apprehended by the Border Patrol and that he was facing deportation proceedings. So there is a narrative shift in this book from myself as being the first-person storyteller. And I thought a lot about this narrative shift when I was writing this book because, of course, my voice narrating this story is a voice of great privilege and is a voice that comes from a position of great power over these people. And so in the third part of this book, the narrative is really turned over to this man, to Jose, and to his story, and to the story of his family. And the book closes with his voice and his voice only. And so when I think about this book and what I would hope that students would take from it, Part of my thinking is like, okay, what if this is the first and only book that someone reads about the border? I hope that it would not be a book that they would put down and then be like, oh, I want to read a bunch of more books by cops. I hope that it's a book that would lead students to listen to more of these voices of people like Jose, voices of the undocumented. And one of the joys of writing nonfiction is that you get to bring in all of your influences, all of your research, and you get to quote directly from it. And so the second section of this book that includes a lot of that research, I really think of that as also functioning as like a further reading list. So another ambition of mine is that a student who finishes reading this book would have a lot of places to look, a lot of voices from the other side of the border, and to continue investigating the border and immigration that way. I think that's all I got for you guys. Thank you so much.